Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
So, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is we're on a panel, and I would like to begin by thanking, and then we could get started with the rest of maybe with a round of introductions quickly, and then I can set the stage.
Thanks, Indira. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Print Value Add Initiative supported by Global Health Strategies. As the COVID-19 pandemic rages on and the Indian health system goes through its most serious challenge ever, we have put together a stellar panel to discuss today's topic, Reimagining India's Health System, Innovating to Improve Access. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists. Dr. Arvind Gupta is the founder member of iSpirit Digital India Foundation. He has been heavily involved in the development of the India Stack, which serves as the foundation of the National Digital Health Mission that Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced in his Independence Day speech this year. Dr. Nargis Mistry is a director and trustee of the Foundation of Medical Research, Mumbai, and the Foundation for Research and Community Health, Pune. In the field of community medicine, Dr. Mistry has had experience in the development of a community-based healthcare system and intervention research in the management of drinking water in rural communities. Dr. Shibu Vijayan is the Global TB Director at The Path. He has over 23 years experience of working across the complete spectrum of public health services and health system strengthening, specifically pertaining to lung diseases, HIV/AIDS, and other neglected diseases. Mr. Prashant Warrior is the CEO and co-founder of Cure AI, a startup that uses artificial intelligence to make diagnostic imaging like X-ray and MRI affordable and accessible. Mr. Gaurav Agarwal is the CTO and co-founder of 1mg. He leads the product and growth team at the Diagnostic and Medicine Delivery Platform. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time out to be at this webinar. I will very briefly take you through the format of this webinar. Each panelist speaks for about 3 to 4 minutes and takes us through their areas of expertise before we open the floor for discussions and, of course, audience questions. Please do keep sending them in on Twitter and YouTube. And now over to you, Indira.
Thanks so much, Avantika, and thank you for agreeing to moderate today. And it's wonderful having you with all the expertise that you bring to this panel as well. So I want to get on with this by thanking all our eminent panelists today for actually participating in this, and of course Print for collaborating with us to create this platform. I'm sure today's discussion is going to be simply fascinating because difficult times such as what the world has been going through over the last few months often go down in history as a testament to the creativity of the human mind and to human resilience. And the healthcare sector in particular, and everybody associated with it, has been under tremendous pressure to adapt and to deliver despite the odds, so as to ensure that their fellow citizens remain safe. And in India, while we've been seeing progress over the years towards the goal of universal health coverage, with the introduction of new policies and programs like Ayushman Bharat, the Poshan Abhiyan, even Mission Indradhanush, in a year so fraught with so many challenges, we've really seen a new vision for what our health system can aspire to be. And since the announcement of the lockdown, there has been a marked shift in the way services are delivered and even consumed. Programs in health departments have really pivoted to reinvent service delivery and revise policy so that collaboration has increased across departments and with the private sector as well, to introduce innovative and new approaches in ensuring access to care. What seemed the most unprecedented challenge of the last few years, and frankly, most of our lifetimes, has become an opportunity to really bring healthcare closer to people's doorsteps. For example, the telemedicine guidelines enabled continuity of care despite all the restrictions that were in place for movement. We are now talking about a health card which could revolutionize the way health data is stored and shared. Health programs like the National TB program, for example, adapted their existing collaborations with the Indian Postal Services to ensure sputum samples were delivered, and they're even piloting the delivery of in a few districts to start with. The government is collaborating with the private sector and private enterprise to create technology solutions like the Arogya Setu app and ensure delivery of medicines through e-pharmacies. Digital health platforms are diversifying the nature and type of information and services they provide, and I'm sure we'll be hearing some of that today as well. There are other innovative models like the adoption of AI and machine learning platforms, which have been prioritized to help screen and triage patients. At the same time, people are being empowered with more information on health and prevailing diseases, and far greater emphasis has been laid on engaging meaningfully with communities to make them more aware of the action that they themselves must take. And this has really improved the uptake of services as well. Prime examples of this are the use of the COVID-19 caller tune, for example, which, yes, it took its time when we'd make our calls, but they really helped making sure that everybody received information about the pandemic and what precautionary measures they needed to take in their local languages. Piloting these new tools is a positive step towards strengthening the country's overall health system, especially if there is greater collaboration between sectors, public, private, and even the non-government civil society, while of course keeping patients at the center of all of these approaches. And so today's webinar provides us that opportunity to discuss the broad contours of these new and innovative strategies and really deliberate on the impact that these policy, programmatic, and community-focused interventions will have in the long run. So thank you all, and thank you for everyone who's actually viewing. Back to you, Avantika, and our panelists.
Thanks, Indira. So I will start with Dr. Arvind Gupta. The Prime Minister's announcement of the National Digital Health Mission this year is probably the biggest thing that has happened in the healthcare system, perhaps since he announced Ayushman Bharat a few years ago. Dr. Gupta, if you can, because you were so involved with the India Stack, if you can share your initial thoughts on the NDHM and how you think it will change the healthcare delivery in India.
Thank you, Avantika and Dr. Indira and GHS as well as the print for having us here. I think, Avantika, our interactions many years ago, I've been talking about the need for a health stack to really not just do incremental change in the way we do and manage healthcare, but completely reimagine it in a complete new transformation. And I think this National Digital Health Mission, by the word of itself, the digital part of it, is really reimagining health and healthcare services and delivery, and in India, and probably going to set up a role model globally. Now, what this really does is really, uses the promise of digital technologies and combines it with the need for accessible and affordable healthcare right at our fingertips at a national level. So this is really transformative in a way that it makes sure that all your health records, the verified doctors, facility providers, insurance providers, be it Ayushman Bharat, and beneficiaries of any nature who are availing government schemes like Ayushman Bharat, as you talked about, which itself is the biggest insurance cover in the world, all come together in a single platform and completely reimagine the way we interact and work with healthcare professionals, with doctors, with claims providers, and it really makes sure that it's both the preventive as well as assistive healthcare, primary healthcare is available to everybody across India. So not just telemedicine, it's finding your own doctor, the doctors having access to your medical records on consent, of course, you getting access to verified doctors throughout the country, and claims getting settled faster because the chance of fraud both sides reduces. So I think this is that whole relook at our healthcare system, and while we keep building more facilities, more hospitals, a brick and mortar, and while we keep doing getting more doctors into the system, we need to ensure that both the private and the public sector come together to solve this whole massive need that I think everybody during the time of the pandemic is really desiring a lot more emphasis on. And so this is that very appropriate time that the Prime Minister has announced the National Digital Health Mission. And the good part is, this is not something that's going to take years to be rolled out. We have pilots already happening in 6 states. The plumbing is ready. I mean, you talked about India Stack. So the payment system, the identity system, the health locker, which is based on the Digit Locker, all those parts are already there. So you have to put a few more parts together, and you will have the system up and running in its complete form as we go ahead. And I think not only the startup community, the medical community, the healthcare professionals, everybody would welcome this as and when it's rolled out throughout the country. The last point I want to make, Avantika, to this is that this is whichever inertia, whether the consumer side, the citizen side, or the provider side had to using digital platforms, COVID has removed all of that. The pandemic has removed all of that. So with the pandemic, everybody has learned that you can get, you can do teleconsultations, e-pharmacies have become a norm, both aided by policy as well as change in consumer behavior. So I think, nobody wanted this crisis to come, this COVID crisis, but one of the outcomes of this is that we will accept this platform, this whole mission when it's rolled out nationally.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. That is actually very interesting, and I have some questions which I'll come back to later. Dr. Narjis Mistry, according to a study you published last year, a TB patient can take up to 65 days and visit 5 to 6 doctors before being initiated on anti-TB treatment. This long cascade of care can have a dangerous impact on the individual's well-being and can increase the chances of transmission of the disease to others. Can you elaborate briefly on the challenges faced by people in accessing healthcare services, including during this pandemic? Because all the figures, we have done stories which show that TB reporting has really gone down in the States, and now we've just got this bidirectional TB and COVID screening directive from the health ministry. So if you can just tell us, how these challenges have impacted TB care and provide some broad suggestions to address them.
Yeah, thanks, Avantika. And thank you for having me on this distinguished panel. So I was asked to talk on decluttering the long cascade to care, and hopefully that doesn't happen for COVID also. But we have news reports coming in of people coming in very late in the course of their disease. But I think some of the experiences from TB might help to clarify this dilemma that we are facing. And of course, in healthcare, time and distance matter, especially in the fragmented healthcare system we live in. And this is portrayed marvelously by the pathways shown by new, say, drug-resistant TB patients. 94 days to diagnosis, average of 10 providers seen between symptoms and treatment initiation, and traveling up to the range of 100 to 650 kilometers in search of treatment and follow-up. So, and whilst we talk about tools to do the decluttering, as the earlier letter of GHS said, I feel a little incomplete to just discussing tools. It's more than just tools. We need ideas and technology, but what we need most is empathy and when we actually plan the system. So a famous anthropologist at Johns Hopkins in a doctrine of non-fragmented healthcare and a good healthcare system wrote that the best way to declutter a pathway to care is when the first provider that any patient accesses is professionally competent. And this I underscore as the biggest gap in the heart pathway for patients, whether it be COVID or TB or cancer or whatever. And as the Prime Minister of Singapore said, the biggest gap between India and advanced East Asia is the quality of medical and paramedical education. We have not invested enough where it matters. And whilst we may have a few good elitist colleges, the education of our paramedical cadres like the ANMs or the ASHAs is severely lacking behind. And we have never invested sufficiently in our dedicated training cadre. In 2013, we had on the radar 200 medical colleges without sufficient teachers. Yeah. And where the training is not enough, I think neither our medical or paramedical cadres will ever be able to win a war. I now come to technologies. Particularly what we require is point of care technologies, integrated laboratories, mechanisms of sample transport, and so on. But there are glitches. For instance, the gene expert in TB has been a game changer, but its use has been less than optimal. So besides introducing technology, we also need to focus on adoption of technologies. I think that's extremely important as we go through the thing. And the second principle I think we need to adopt when we bring in a technology into the field is the question of equity, leave no one behind. We should not have a divide between, say, our urban and rural areas in the use of that technology. In terms of additional technologies which we might need to declutter pathways to care, either for COVID or for whatever infectious disease that we will face in the future, there'll be other pandemics and epidemics that we face. I would identify geospatial technologies for better health planning and health facility planning, particularly in relationship to location. And geospatial technology can also triage with prevalence or genomic information to give, say, focused information on disease transmission, the rapidity of disease manifestation, and deployment of focused resources for control. And of course, a single digitized health repository with a unique health ID would be greatly advantageous. But remember, the greatest skill in investing in any kind of venture or issue or technology is the ability to make good decisions using imperfect information. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. And one of the last things that I'd like to say is that in decluttering long pathways, when systems are weak or are trying to improve with regard to dealing with vulnerable populations, and we have a huge segment of vulnerable populations, you need a certain amount of support with the community who understand local problems. And in urban areas, such community supports needs to be consciously developed as an independent extra system appendage that should not be co-opted just for service delivery. And the moot point is how do you support such capers, but we can discuss that later. In terms of the raging COVID epidemic, I think the best generalized answers can be got from what we call the exemplar countries. So what they have, the common factors that have come out is strong leadership, both at the federal and the local level, using clear communications on public health principles to ordinary people. They have a right to know. And of course, I think the exemplar could also be Dharavi. Release of adequate resources, financial resources, going much above the 1%, less than 1% of GDP that we are spending at the moment. And no denial of approach to healthcare or a threatening access. That's extremely important for stigmatizing diseases like COVID. And what the COVID pandemic has shown is it's not just advanced high-tech science, but public health capacity on the ground that actually determines the course of these pandemics. You need good technology judgment in the country to know which tests to employ, which one's the best, and a good level of care judgment that's required. Availability of social protection and practice, not of equity and not just lip service. And trying to make sure that the fault lines in society rendered by any pandemic are softened. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mistry. Dr. Shibu Vijayan, it is estimated that over 70% of the population visits the private sector for care. Ensuring the availability of quality care at affordable prices in the private sector is therefore critical. Considering your expertise in managing public-private partnerships, how should the public sector be partnering with the private sector to expand access, especially in hard-to-reach places? And what does the private sector need to make them an effective ally?
Yeah, so thank you, Avantika, and also GHS and the print team to have me on this August panel. I mean, I would start where Dr. Nargis actually stopped. I mean, and also mentioned about the long delay in getting services, 65 days, and almost 10 doctors shop. So that's where and when we talk about doctors and private providers in India, it's actually very diverse. It starts from the informal sector, it's from the traditional killer to the five-star hospital. So in Dr. Nargis' study, if you map each provider's profile is actually different, and again, multiple bounce back is happening. So the private sector, when we talk in India, is not the classical private sector, qualified private sector. It's a diverse, plural pool of private sector, and this 70% actually constitutes to all the pathies in different proportion of representation, and also patient goes as per their preference, as per their access to, the proximity and their cultural practices, prevailing practices. So the private sector is very, very wide in that sense. We cannot actually put them in one basket. In our experience, actually, we need to partner with private sector. That's no question about it. And again, Government of India's inclinations and the policy directions are towards that. So one of the things what we have done is actually we have extensively worked with the private providers, which include all the pathis of providers, informal as well as the formal providers. One thing we also realized that the classical hesitance from the government side to engage with the private sector is actually the fear of having lesser quality and higher cost. And that fear actually restricts us to engage. From a public standpoint, we restricts us to go and engage with the private sector, given that there is a profit around it and also the unknown quality around it. So what we learned is that once we engage and walk along, there is opportunity to actually change the behavior. So there is a lot of behavior change from the public side has to happen, and be open to engage with the private sector, given that we have 70% of the people going and taking care from there. So when we think about universal healthcare, we cannot have a heavily publicly dominated universal healthcare in a country like India. So that's where engage. So we always realize that this is actually a factor of engaging and elevating the quality rather than actually training them and elevating. And so it's a journey like a marriage, walking along and then building that relationship and trust over a period of time. So both the parties need to be aligned with that and ready to partner with that. So here comes the importance of where the government has the bandwidth to do it. So in our experience, we realize that there is a need for an interface agency or a third party to engage, who clearly understand the private priorities and also the government public health responsibility. So what we tested it's an interface agency, a third party as an entity to work with both the parties and agree upon minimal set of requirements, which actually complies with the larger goal of public health and also ensures the patient to get the needy services, quality services. And we also inculcated the behavior of the private sector to incline towards the quality services, like by right prescriptions, right referral, timely referral. So when I said, different parties are involved, even the informal provider had a role. So if I'm an informal provider, I have to refer the patient to a quality provider. And I have a role later to actually track my patient. So everyone in the ecosystem had a role and we didn't disturb that. So I think moving forward that the partnership is more like all the parties having that role and also identifying the right interface agencies to connect with. So in our context, it was actually the interface agency was as an NGO, or even now the Government of India is actually contracting local NGOs or local parties to do it. So in a system of digital world, when Arvind mentioned about we can identify digitally doctor, provider, public health system, this interface agency could transition into a digital platform. So tomorrow the third party would be if complete digitalization would happen, then major chunk of this will probably move into. So that transparency will give more confidence to government as well as the private. So I would say this is more building trust over a period of time, and digital would be the answer when we move towards the transition. And also the community structures, as Dr. Mistry mentioned, would actually help the patient in the empathy part will bring in. So probably the digital would not be the replacement for an empathy part to construct the patient, the correct, right environment to be. So I would say the dividends for the public-private sector is actually largely the public health benefits. So if you are actually seeing your patient for a longer period, and that is actually a dividend. So if I'm a private doctor, if the public health system is tracking the patient on treatment or screening them rightly and bringing them back to me, it's actually benefit for me, building trust and also on the revenue standpoint. So the starting point is going to be difficult. As we also learned, it took almost 2-3 years to actually reach a optimal break even, I would say. But after that, when we gain the confidence, when they see the benefit out of it, this will actually fly. And technology is actually a force multiplier in this thing. So that I will elaborate on the later side. Later part of the panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vijayan. And actually, that's a very interesting point about empathy in a digital health environment where we're talking about technologies. In recent years, I have seen an explosion in available artificial intelligence programs that can benefit the healthcare sector immensely. Mr. Prashant Warrior, you're right?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
So, as a bold and relatively new frontier in health, what problems can AI solve and how scalable is its deployment?
So AI can solve a large number of problems. I mean, there is a lot of data that is being generated. I mean, there are X-ray, CT scans, MRIs that will be processed. There is a lot of patient data that is available that can be used, and AI can help make decisions, right? And I'll talk about at least our journey at Cure, right? So I run a company called Cure.ai, which uses AI to interpret radiology images. And when we started this company in 2016, we thought that our key markets would be North America and Europe, the developed part of the world, because there the healthcare system is far more mature. And I thought that for them to adopt these AI technologies would be easier. But as we sort of worked on this over the last 3-4 years, we realized that the need is far higher in countries like India, Southeast Asia, Africa, where the quality of care is quite poor, and AI is needed to help improve that quality of care, right? And there is not consistent care. So for example, one of the things that we have seen is that the number of radiologists in India is about 1/3 the number of radiologists in the US, for a population which is 4 times the number of 4 times that of US, right? So you have 1/12 the number of radiologists per person in India. And so then that quality of the radiologist also changes. I mean, a lot of radiologists want to stay in the cities. If you go to rural part of India, you will not find radiologists there. To get even a simple X-ray read, you'll find it very difficult, right? And lots of parts of the country, you don't have a simple X-ray being read by a radiologist, several parts of the country. And that is where AI can play a big role, right? That is where AI can come in and provide quality interpretation of X-rays, CT scans, MRIs in places where there is lack of access to trained professionals in interpreting that. And I also like to think of this as similar to financial technology, right? So banking and finance has been so developed in the US and Europe for a long time. But if you look at mobile payments or online payments, things like Paytm, we have overtaken those countries in terms of how our financial payment system works in India. And paying somebody in India is so much faster now as compared to some of the developed countries. I mean, making a mobile payment in the US is so much harder now. And I think AI is also going to be very similar in that, I mean, especially in healthcare, that we'll provide the access is needed in places where they don't have quality radiology, quality healthcare. And that's where AI can make a big difference.
Thank you, Mr. Warrior. With people tending to reduce the number of in-person interactions and travel, e-pharmacies are changing the way we view direct-to-home services in health. Our next panelist is Mr. Gaurav Agarwal. Mr. Agarwal, beyond the business aspect, how can e-pharmacies serve to drive a shift in delivery of public health?
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I recognize a couple of friends here. So, I think a lot has been said about technology and what technology can do to drive access, affordability, and adoption of healthcare throughout the population. We've already seen in the last few years how digital health has gone through, almost like a rocket ship growth, where large portions of the industry are now accessing their medicines at home through e-pharmacy platforms or diagnostic tests at home through diagnostic platforms like 1mg. And with COVID, the teleconsultation platforms themselves have seen a massive rise. What has happened is, and as we continue to think about a lot of, if we were to design a healthcare system from scratch today, what would it look like? And I'm pretty sure that every one of us would think of a system which is hybrid, which is digital technologies massively buttressing the offline ecosystem access that's available. In India, especially in a situation where we find ourselves where our public health infrastructure lags, right? That of the needs of the nation. Dr. Mistry talked about tuberculosis, and 1mg has experience actually enabling tuberculosis tracking in Andhra Pradesh. So there was a problem in Andhra Pradesh where the government was dealing with drug-resistant TB. And it was happening because the courses of patients were not being followed. The medication was not being dispensed properly. Patients were not getting their refills. Some of them were not taking medications at time. Some of them were overdosing on the medicines as well. And so what 1mg built, of course, pro bono for the government, was a way to track all prescription and dispensation of TB drugs in the public health infrastructure. In the public health infrastructure, when it comes to, let's say, TB, we know about the Nikshay platform, right, which basically tracks the adherence of TB patients across the whole platform. So I feel that digital platforms are absolutely essential to driving healthcare services. Again, if you go back to TB, which is probably an area where the government and public sector are driving a lot of initiative to identify, let's say, the missing million and also identify treatments. We all know that diagnosis of TB patients is a huge problem because they have to travel to centers, multiple travel visits are required to actually get diagnosis. Now think of a digital platform where a person doesn't need to travel, doesn't need to have, let's say, non-working days, non-payment days, and a digital platform can essentially schedule, get the test done, take it back to a lab. Something that gets enabled even today for a lot of us who live in metros. When I need to get a test done, I don't leave the comfort of my home. Someone who's a trained phlebotomist comes home, takes my sample, takes it to an authorized laboratory, and gets a test done in a safe, reliable, trackable manner, right? Why can't we bring the same to public health, to the auspices of public health, right? Think of telemedicine, right? We know Prashant talked about people not getting access to radiologists, right? Same is true for doctors, right? We have, according to WHO standards, we have probably one of the lowest doctor densities in the world for the number of patients we have, especially for NCDs, etc. as well. Why can't, technology and e-pharmacies, e-consultation platforms can play a huge role in making care available. With COVID, we have seen that, right? With COVID, a lot of platforms have made COVID consultations available online, remote monitoring online. In fact, the government even came out with a mandate where they said that if you're not at high risk, then digital platforms can do the monitoring for you at home, either through applications or through phone calls, and then basically share the data with the government. So technology platforms, especially in healthcare, have a fundamental ability to reduce the caseload, make sure that physical infrastructure, public health infrastructure sees patients who actually need it. They can do early triaging, early diagnosis, and overall bring the cost of care down. And I think that is a huge, huge role that public infrastructure can play. I'm extremely excited about what the government is doing with NDHM. It's transformational. I think 5 years down the line, we are going to look at India as a country and say that we really leapfrogged the healthcare revolution and I'm hoping, we can all hope for the best. But I think that the intent and the steps are in that direction, where you have, one technology backend for all data and digital health records moving across a single backplane you can access, where people can build longitudinal health records. Nowhere in the world is data made available in a way that longitudinal health records or health analysis is possible, where I can say that, hey, you have these diseases, this is how your disease progression has been over a period of time, and this is how you can get better if you take these steps. But with NDHM, with PHR, India can finally make that happen. So huge potential, massive role that private healthcare and technology can play in public health assistance programs as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So very interesting points there, use of technology and the role of private healthcare. However, while a lot of our panelists spoke about private healthcare, one very important thing that has happened during COVID, I don't know if it's important, but it's been very revealing, is that the private sector has not been very forthcoming in COVID. Hospitals have been reluctant to take, so COVID patients, they're feared that they'll be labeled COVID hospital and there'll be stigma and all of that. So actually, that the interplay of public-private has played out very interestingly during COVID. So we'll throw the floor open for questions. Please do send in your questions on YouTube and Twitter. And while we talk about technologies, Dr. Arvind Gupta, there's a question I have for you. There are huge privacy concerns, of the same kinds that were there when Aadhaar was launched. And now that NDHM is being launched, so data privacy, this huge amounts of data that will be generated and stored. And there will be partners who will be storing that data. So how would you allay those concerns? How would you address those concerns?
With Abantika, with any digital platform comes its own concerns, right? You will have concerns, and the job of the platform is to allay those concerns, to make sure that all those consultations address the concerns of the citizens, civil society, doctors, healthcare professionals, startups, and everybody else. But 2 or 3 very important points. The National Digital Health Mission, in a way, is if you take the entitlements and the claims engines away, where Ayushman Bharat is, you need to have Aadhaar. This is built on top of Aadhaar. So all the security, all the data security around Aadhaar still applies here. 2, it's all consent based. So it's opt-in consent. When I opt in and give consent to somebody for Cure.ai to analyze, and then put that, the analysis back into my system, and then I want to show that diagnostic to a doctor, I give that access to which doctor I want to give access to. And that's the whole fundamental consent architecture that it is built on. And as you know, India is building that big PDP, the data empowerment and protection architecture. Everything will fall as a subset of that. So 2 very clear points on data. Number 1, health data is very, very personal. You are going to store a lot of longitudinal data, lifelong data, diagnostics to consultations to what medicines, your compliance to those medicines. And if you want to share with specialists or doctors, you will give consent to that and to what level of data you are giving access to. And then people can have, then look at those data and in a limited time frame. Of course, they can't share further. The second aspect of this is that personal data, non-private data can also be used for making certain, analytics. But that's a different thing. But from a personal perspective, from my data protection, I'm going to use this with consent and then share it there and there forward. The other aspect is the health, the financial information aspect. It is integrated with my bank systems like anything else. It's my wallet to make payments. It's my wallet to buy medicines. I have the whole, the easiness, the frictionless payment system attached to it. And if I am a beneficiary of any of the insurance claims, whether it's the Ayushman Bharat or any other system, then that becomes completely cashless, and it's I authorize the treatment from a particular facilities provider, and then the insurance, the claims provider approves it, the pricing is approved, and it becomes completely cashless for me, even paymentless. So I think there is a lot of aspects to this, but we have to keep working on ensuring that the health and health data privacy and the systems and the technology and the regulation around us is very, very tight, and just ensure the compliance is as complete as possible.
So throughout this discussion, and this is a question I'm asking Dr. Gupta, but please feel free to, say if you want to answer, please feel free to do so, because this is a question that pertains to what a lot of, I think all of you say it in some way or the other. See, in India, we have very poor literacy. We have perhaps even poorer digital literacy. We, even for clinical trials, we had to put in a thing about in-camera consent because people could be misled. How will those concerns be addressed with more and more use of technology? And specifically, I wanted to ask this question in the NDHM context to Dr. Gupta, but actually it applies everywhere with, more use of technology, more use of telemedicine and all of that. How will that be addressed?
See, I'll just take a shot at that. See, I think the point, the higher level point you're taking is when we are trying to use any digital platform and, people do get gamed, and are they doing things knowingly, or are they giving their consent knowingly, and into what are the outcomes, knowing the possible outcomes? A lot of times, no. And we've seen that, you're right. And I think that's where a PDP law is important, a regulation is important. Once that comes into play, you can't even ask for, for data for certain things without defined purpose. So that will limit the misuse of it, overall misuse of it. In the absence of that law, we see a lot of omnibus consent being taken and being used for something else. But having said that, your point is absolutely valid. We need more digital literacy. We need more data literacy in terms of why this data is important for you to give to the right people only. And that goes without saying. So, and they have to go hand in hand. You can't, it's not an either or situation. It's an and situation. We have to solve both the problems together. As simple as that.
Yeah. If I may add, I think Arvind made a very, very good point. No system comes with just pros and no cons, right? We have today's system where a patient actually doesn't have all the health records in one place, probably has paper prescriptions, paper reports, hard to read, carries a big folder from one place to another. When he goes to a doctor, the doctor doesn't know his previous history, cannot get a summary sheet. I still go to doctors with my mom, and the doctor has to write her whole history all over again every single time. And, in a healthcare ecosystem like India, which is already so strapped, that's not a great use of time. And so I think we have to consider digital tools for the benefits they bring, and then build moats or walls around them for the cons that they bring as well, right? So there is definitely a risk of privacy when it comes with, all your data being in one place. Sure, makes it more vulnerable, but I think that the conversations that have been happening for a while, the Sri Krishna report, the Disha, that came into public domain, they're already very reasonably well thought out and robust frameworks for law that actually prevents miscreants from misusing your data, puts in very, very strong penalties against it. So I think let's approach it for the pros, and let's prevent the cons and build as robust a system as possible. There's no system that exists, even today's system, without its cons. I can take anyone's prescription, walk into any clinic, get any treatment, any drug, probably OD, fall sick, right? So there's cons in today's systems as well. But I think in general, we are headed in the right direction.
Avantika, could I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes, to Mr. Gupta. So I just go beyond the misuse of data and just wanted to ask if this digitalized system could actually look at some of the analytical part of it. Can it be used, say, for instance, for evaluating or doing prescription audits?
Prescription compliance?
Sorry?
You're talking about prescription compliance or?
No, prescription audits. So for a particular set of conditions, What is the variance in the prescription patterns? Is that sort of conforming to quality in healthcare? Those sort of analytics.
Let me give
That
you an
is
answer.
something.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, Dr. Mistry, that's a very valid question. And that's something that researchers would like to know, public policy, health, policy professionals would like to know. Um, Again, depends on if I have consented for my prescription to participate in that study, if you may call that. But yes, it's easier instead of physically doing it.
That's right.
If tomorrow you were to look at, ask for 10,000 prescriptions to study this, and 10,000 people otherwise would be very difficult
to yeah, that's
send
right.
to and to get onto a system to say yes to it.
Yeah.
Here you could do that, but again, it comes. I have to say that very clearly. It comes with consent. You cannot just nobody can just click a button and say I'm studying this. It has to be a two-way consent.
Yeah.
And here the two-way consent. It's both the doctor as well as
the patient. Yeah, I get that. Thank you.
My next question actually is, Dr. Mistry, for you.
Okay.
Can I make a point here? Can I just add a point here?
Yeah, sure, please.
You can do all of this if you have reimagined your health system. Gaurav talked about paper, handwritten. We don't know what it's written half the times. We have legibility of the systems. Everybody has their own prescription formats, diagnostic formats. There is no standardization. This also really a common digital platform brings about standards in the way we understand records. And I think we sometimes underplay that important issue, because this is that core of it. That's why they're interoperable. It's going to be working with everybody, and it makes sure that we understand what's going on. So I think that's a very important point when we try to build a system of this nature, which is going to serve 130 crore people in India. So I think I just wanted to add to that point.
Dr. Mistry, I wanted to ask you, you in your opening remarks, you mentioned the importance of boots on the ground, health workers on the ground. And one of the things that COVID has shown, our cities are so badly hit, and we just don't have the people. We don't have health workers to do contact tracing. We've taken workers from all programs, including TB, and deployed them for COVID because we don't have dedicated trained people. So how do you think we can address this issue?
Yeah, so I allude.
You have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay. Is that all right?
Yeah.
So I talked about that a little in my introductory remarks. And I think I have got reasonable amount of evidence about the competencies of health workers, particularly those that are working in primary care. And I think when you look at those challenges of having the right type of competencies in these paramedical workers, as we call them, forget the higher medical echelons, I think you have to look at both the technical inputs that need to be given, but that's just insufficient. But to achieve their full potential, you need to look at both context and mechanisms of these sort of people. So if you look at A&Ms, and they carry a huge load of this COVID effort that's going on. She is about a 12th standard passed lady with minimal qualifications, a very poor primary education, and you expect her to do a whole heap of things. She's considered as a multi-purpose worker. She's considered as also a maternal and child health deliverer, and so on. And for the private schools that she goes to, the private schools particularly that train these paramedical workers, there's a great deal of lack of quality and content. And when they go to work in their places, there is poor infrastructure at the facility that they work in, poor transport, no water and sanitation, security concerns, electricity, etc. Then, of course, for their security, they lean on local politicians and village leaders for their security. In terms of the coverage that they have to do, an A&M is supposed to cover, as a sub-center manager, 5,000 population, but they cover anything from 7,000 to 36,000 per sub-center. Poor record-keeping skills. So when we talk about this digitization of records and all, they'll be probably one of the main players that will have to do that. And you have to infuse a set of literacy skills within them. Yeah. And of course, they've been having challenges in that too. Now, in terms of the training that they receive, and that holds true for, again, I think any paramedical worker that we bring forth today, they don't have that hands-on experience. It's didactic training. They, for instance, ANMs have no training on basic pharmacology and contraindications for basic medicine. Not able to undertake a regular supervision is never prioritized in their work thing. The emphasis on checking and penalizing. That's what the system comes down to. And there are no guidelines or measures for which can be sort of guides supervisors. How do you do supportive supervision? For instance, they're also made to work with other cadres which have not been given any formal responsibility. For instance, ANMs work with multipurpose workers who are male, and you cannot hold them accountable also. So, and the other thing is, I think we need to look at it again with empathy, with a different lens. ANMs particularly, again, and even the ASHAs for that matter, have no career path to progress. Yeah. So you need to have a trajectory for them to be able to take their work seriously and to aspire to do better and with more complex skills. And you need to define their roles if they're working in a pandemic situation as what they can do and cannot do, and the training should be geared towards that. And I could tell you if there's more time about what type of training should be given to them. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Vijay, I wanted to ask you, during COVID, it's in fact, during the first few months, that was the case. The entire system, everything was just focused on COVID. So it was as if the other diseases were not there. So it was very difficult for people to access. OPDs had been closed down. There was a lockdown. People couldn't travel. So people could not access healthcare. So if you could bring a global perspective, on the tools and best practices that could be adapted to the Indian landscape to improve access to healthcare services.
Yeah, so well, I think the globe took this disease in a shock. So everywhere there are bits and pieces of practices. Within India also we have wide range of practices which are good and bad, and then over a period of time, the good also will change into. So there is a lot of moving parts, and we don't have a prescribed practice as of now. But I think by and large, in a prevalence low setting, when the initial part of the pandemic, a tracking-based system, so not necessarily a testing-based system. So if you identify a case and tracking and isolating that actually worked well, when it bursted to actually much more prevalent, the testing-based system works. So we can see that two models actually initially when that is true for any public health disease. Like any public health disease of less prevalence, if you actually focus on basic tracking and isolating, it works well. But here testing is actually more important. So the best example I could actually look at is the Vietnam. So WHO says actually, you have to bring down, the test for per positive case is something around 35 is optimal, 30 to 35 is optimal. Vietnam did actually around 1,000 tests. So that is way far. It's kind of an outlier. And if you look at now, so today morning I was with my colleagues from Vietnam. They all are actually stacked up in a room without mask. They are actually talking to me over the. So that is the level of confidence they have. They also have outbreaks now, so in some beaches and clubs. But again, that's again focused out. So if we have that, I would say if India need to reach that level, then our testing need to actually go up per 100. At least per. So the other example is if you look at New Zealand, that's around 250 per test cases test positives. So we are now somewhere around in the 10s and 20s. There are certain states around slightly just below 30s. Certain states are actually way beyond. It's in single digit, I would say. So the single mantra to tell how we can tackle is you have to bump up your testing. And so once you test, then the rest of the public health things.
Tests now, how much per day testing? Do you have like a number in mind? We're doing 11 lakh right now.
No, so I think we are doing it like we have improved a lot. There is no question about it. But given that to reach that level of what I said, at least to hit the 35, we need to bump up at least 5 times more. So we need a 5 million or 50 lakhs tests per day, given the size of the epidemic, to start with. So it means, so I think the roadmap to when, so we have to define the milestones also. So now Prime Minister said in later, in early September, we will have to have 10 lakh tests per day. So what is that actually roadmap when we say hit September 15th? Is it going to be 50 lakh tests per day? So when are we going to hit 1 crore tests per day? So that is actually if you plan that, the systems has to be framed in that. So otherwise, there is no other solution. As of now, if you look at the world, if you have to bump up your testing to to level possible to reach at least to hit 1/3 of the Vietnam's way. That is 250. To have that confidence.
Okay, so we have some viewer questions coming in. So Ayan Datta has asked, is fully centralized universal healthcare better than private-public cooperation, or does it depend on political regime and other factors? Oh. Whoever among you wants to take that up.
I can just give you my perspective. I think the question itself is wrong. There is no centralized regime. We are talking about public, private, entrepreneurs, everybody part of this ecosystem. That's what this discussion is all about. On the other hand, I think healthcare has become, and I think the pandemic and others have caused healthcare to people to demand a lot of accountability from healthcare. So I think it should become, while it remains a very political topic, as a subject, but I think citizens are going to ask for a lot of more accountability from their healthcare outcomes. So that's a good ask of citizens of their governments. So
I would agree also with Mr. Gupta in that. I think there needs to be a synergy between accountability and quality of healthcare that's come about. Whether you have a healthcare system in Canada, for instance, which is completely privatized. They don't have a sort of a public health system cater there, but they still contribute towards public health system. So that sort of synergy needs to be brought into the Indian system in whichever way that's thought necessary, to be able to harness the private doctors or the private system also into giving public system benefits.
So, Sarandika, just one point. So I think so. What we need to build on as health system based on 2 factors. One is the quality of care, and then affordability part. So the universal health. So we don't need to distinguish between public and private. I think moving forward, that distinction which actually will create more problem. Focus on outcomes and quality of care. So then you have the resource in a given geography. You have private and public and diverse resources. You need to be able to put that in an ecosystem with a positive outcome. So let's say if I'm taking in a panchayat in my district, so my goal is to achieve my SDGs, not necessarily differentiate between who is going to play what role. So I have all the resources pulled into one ecosystem to achieve that. So I think the valid points when Arvind made that distinction or regimen, a centralized approach is, regimental approach is not the right thing. What we need to define is what is the desirable outcome and the quality of care. That is across all the platforms. So the public also need to be accountable for that.
Actually, there's a problem in sort of understand for the average citizen. I think that distinction is very, it's so much there that you can't ignore it. The fact that you pay in one and you don't pay in another, and that kind of changes everything. So while I understand the importance of looking at outcomes, so for the average citizen, there's a huge problem in that. Unless there's some sort of centralized, like Ayushman Bharat has done, some sort of pooling of resources and empowerment of hospitals and all of that. Otherwise, and that doesn't seem to be happening at a larger scale at this current moment. There's another question on the correlation. So Shashank 296 is asking, what is the correlation between GDP spend and healthcare? And what would be the adequate GDP spend ratio to adequately overhaul India's healthcare?
If I may just take that very briefly, I think there have been a lot of commissions that have looked at it as to what will be actually required to overall. And I think if I remember, the Jeffrey Sachs Commission some years ago had actually said anything between 4 to 6% of GDP would be required to overhaul India's healthcare. So that's something that we've been moving up very, very incrementally. There was a little blip around, say, 2007, 2008, when the GDP had marginally crept up, but it seems to have gone back down again. And that's something you definitely require more resources. So we've been talking about improvements in digitization, quality of healthcare, training of paramedicals, but all this will require financial resources. And the COVID situation has shown very clearly that in countries like Germany, which put in, as I said, both federal as well as local resources, financial resources, the results are much better. So we definitely, there's no doubt about it, and I don't think there needs to be a debate. We definitely require an increase in GDP.
We've been setting a target of 2.5% for ourselves for as long as
Long time, but I don't think we've even reached that. Yeah.
No, we are at 1 actually. So
yeah. So
there are some questions which have come in, but I think we've answered these. There's a question. So Akshay Ravi asks, how do you ensure accuracy of AI in diagnostics? If AI is used, would a registered medical practitioner not have to analyze the scans and reports to confirm, adding an additional layer to the processes?
So multiple parts to the answer. One is that, I mean, the AI algorithms that are developed are tested against radiologists. So at least the algorithms that we develop and other companies, other institutions, even IITs are developing that. They are compared against the standard of care, or compared against, for example, in TB, the gene expert test, where you can say that the algorithm is performing at the level of a medical practitioner, or sometimes even better than the level of a medical practitioner. For example, Stop TB Partnership recently conducted a study where they compared the Cure AI chest X-ray interpretation algorithm against 4 other international chest X-ray interpretation algorithms compared to a radiologist, right? Compared to a panel of radiologists. And they found that all the algorithms, all these 5 different companies produced algorithms which are more accurate than a radiologist, right? So, and substantially more accurate than a radiologist. So that's one. That said, I mean, today AI is not ready to take over a radiologist, replace a radiologist, or replace a medical practitioner. What it is doing is providing an assistive tool for the interpretation of the X-ray. So, for example, I'll talk about how we use this in Philippines. So in Philippines, they have these mobile vans for TB screening. So this is used for active case finding in TB. And so these 4 mobile vans that travel around the country. They have an X-ray system within the van, and every day they would take about 100 X-rays within that van, and then they would travel around the country for about 2 weeks and come back to Manila. Manila is where they start from, and then they have all these X-rays which have been collected over that 2-week period. And so there is no radiologist on the mobile van where the X-ray is being taken, so they cannot get an instantaneous report. And what happens is once they come back to Manila, they send the X-rays for reading. It takes about 3 to 4 weeks for an X-ray to be read by a radiologist, right? So somebody comes in on day 1, they get an X-ray read at the end of week 3 or week 4. With the algorithms that we have developed, that X-ray can be read instantaneously. So what happens is X-ray is taken within a minute. You can say that, yeah, this X-ray is likely to have TB or not. And if you say that this is likely to have TB, then that patient would go in and get a gene expert test. So they would give a sputum sample, and then the sputum sample would be tested using the gene expert test that Dr. Mistry mentioned earlier. So again, that process, which was about 3-4 weeks long, can now be sort of compressed into a single day, sometimes even a few hours. So that is how we are improving the diagnostic space, right? That is, again, it is assisting a health worker, assisting a physician in doing that. Think about what we're doing in certain parts of India where we are providing a surveillance tool. So a lot of times TB, I mean, again, as Dr. Mistry mentioned, that TB is not immediately diagnosed. When somebody goes in to the doctor, I mean, they might think of other conditions, they might think of other diseases, but they may not immediately diagnose TB. So what we're doing in certain parts, in fact, one city is now starting to use that, is every hospital in that city will have our algorithms embedded into the X-ray system. So we find that there is a case where there is likely to be a patient has likely TB. Immediately we will inform the technician there or the practitioner there that this person could have TB, and you should send this person to get a gene expert test done. So by taking that call at that point of care, rather than, I mean, that patient takes an X-ray, goes back, maybe gets some medication, and then doesn't get diagnosed with TB for 6 weeks, again, by making that intervention at the point of care, by providing the AI interpretation, you can substantially change the quality of care for that TB patient. So again, that is again assisting a radiologist, assisting a technician, assisting a physician. So I think everywhere that we are seeing, we are helping the quality of care being improved. And I'll also talk about some of the work we are done with COVID. So in BMC, in the Bombay, Mumbai Municipal Corporation, they had these mobile vans go into the slums in the city, and they were screening a lot of people. So now what they were doing is that they were screening all the contacts of COVID-19 patients. Now, a lot of those contacts are asymptomatic. So how do you test all of them, right? If I have COVID-19, I've got 20 people that I have been in touch with. Really, you don't want to test all of them. You may not have testing capacity to test all of them. And so what they were doing at some point was that they said, out of these 20, we'll take chest X-rays for all of them, and an algorithm will score the likelihood of that person having TB, whether it's high, medium, or low. And if that likelihood of having COVID, if the likelihood of having COVID is high, that person would then get a test. So what we are doing is, out of 100 people that need to be tested, we're saying that these 15 need to be tested. And of those 15 that need to be tested, the percentage of people who actually had COVID was about 85%. So it radically improved the efficacy of the testing, radically improved the output, the number of cases that were identified by doing a simple triage like this. So again, summarize, what AI is doing right now is not replacing practitioners or replacing radiologists. It is helping them triage better, helping them look at the right patients. It is helping them report accurately.
And can I just add to that, Abantika? During COVID times, what we have seen is where a cloud ER, AI-based thing is helping collate basic parameters, what Prashant has just talked about, save time of the ER workers to respond, basically, I don't think so. We are at a stage where we are going to replace, the actual practitioners, but it's becoming more and more assistive and a lot more accurate. The confidence levels of these algorithms will only keep going up as more data keeps coming in, more computing power keeps coming in, and more learning keeps coming in. So you'll only get better. These technologies and algorithms will only get better. But one thing will be very, very important, that they will continue to save a lot of time and provide a lot of access and affordability, because certainly when human time is of premium, AI-led diagnostics or triages or anything else will cut down the time and will make it more available, so your cost can really reduce. And this is another very big important outcome that we are looking at rolling out when we are rolling out digital platforms.
May I add another dimension to this AI thing? If I may ask Mr. Warrior, is there been any sort of investigation whether AI sort of as an assistant to the clinician, has it been ever compared to animal models of detection of infectious disease? We know that in Belgium, for instance, TB can be sniffed out by dogs, trained actually. And the United Arab Emirates at the airports at Abu Dhabi and Dubai, if I'm not mistaken, are using sniffer dogs to sniff out COVID from sweat within 2 minutes thing. So, this is just another sort of technology that comes in that assists the clinician in deciding what. So there are various, of course, AI is wonderful. And I think in due course, we'll see a lot of advantages. It's good for whole genome sequencing and looking at the validity of mutations and drug resistance and all the rest of it. But there are biological models also, which may be compared to almost like, canine intelligence, or what we would like to call that. Just another perspective, that's all. And an interesting one.
That's a very interesting perspective. Actually, I don't think AI has been compared to those kinds of technologies or models at all.
Yeah, and it's been highly sensitive and specific. In Belgium, the national policy is to use sniffer dogs to vet out tuberculosis, and it's the specificity and sensitivity is extremely high.
Just to supplement actually what Prashant said. We used the AI technology in one of the cities in Nagpur. We deployed it, and we found that we got 20% extra cases detected when we compared to the radiologist reading versus the machine read. So these are confirmed TB cases. So there is actually, I mean, what we have seen, there is a level of improved case detection and with a lesser turnaround time. The second part is a quality control. If I'm a radiologist, if I use the system in my, I mean, that is actually a quality control for me. So if there is a discordance between machine reading and my interpretation, I could go back and then relook at the system. So that element is also not explored well. So I mean, as we move along, so I mean, this all need to be thought in the framework of a national digital health mission. So when all this comes, then a lot of transparency comes in, quality control comes in, which is technology enabled. Thank you.
There's an audience question for Mr. Gaurav Agarwal. Shankar is asking, there has been quite a lot of opposition from traditional pharmacies to e-pharmacies. Also, right now, e-pharmacies are also a part of this NDHM plan. So, but how do you plan to sort of address this? Do you plan to bring in traditional pharmacies into the fold by becoming aggregators? And if I can add to that, how do you foresee expansion into rural markets where storage and delivery, all of that is much more difficult than in an urban setting?
Yeah, so, just to clear a couple of, points first. First is that most e-pharmacies, at least 1mg and the ones that we are aware of, they actually work as aggregators. So most of us work with small mom and pop shops, even large retail chains on figuring out supply, etc. Because most of us are FDI funded. We have the market-based aggregator model. And that's how we work on these models. 1mg today, for instance, works with around 1,000 pharmacies and other pharmaceutical product partners, market-based partners across the country on making sure that deliveries, etc. happen. Now, in that, of course, we do a lot of optimization. Some pharmacies are small, some are large, some areas have multiple pharmacies that provide supply. But we work with pharmacies, so that's one. The second is around opposition. Look, by and large, there's always opposition to change, right? We've heard opposition to digital platforms coming because there's a privacy concern. We often tend to not look at what was the situation before, and are we generally headed in the right direction, headed to better models? There's everything has pros and cons. Like I said earlier, commerce, electronic commerce in general has a lot of pros, has cons as well, and we need to build systems and safeguard systems to make sure that it doesn't have unintended effects. Livelihood, etc. They need to be protected. Skilling and job opportunities need to be there. Skilling is one of the core initiatives of this government as well. So skilling and job opportunities will take care of some of those concerns, right? Now, an additional point is that if you look at it, right, when we were in lockdown, a big part of the reason why people were able to get access to healthcare services was because we had an electronic infrastructure, right? Imagine a situation where COVID would have hit, we would have not had an electronic infrastructure for, let's say, consumers placing orders, getting them verified, getting them delivered. It would have been a nightmare. And so I think we have to understand that what does the future look like? A future is definitely omni-channel. It will be physical, it will be digital. And we just need to figure out how these ecosystems exist. How do we protect both sides, and how do we create level playing fields for people who play on either side of that equation?
There's another audience question. We've dealt with this in a different format, but I find this question interesting. So Arvind Srivastava asks, how much computer literacy is required to make telemedicine or employment of digital technology, AI, handy to the public at large? Do we have a sense?
I would say very little. Meaning, if you look at people, they're using WhatsApp.
I was going to say the same.
Yeah, India has 400 million people using WhatsApp. They are doing video calls. They're doing audio messages. They're doing everything, and that's all you need for telemedicine and AI. Meaning, you can initiate a video call with your doctor. You can get a message. It's a structured message. You initiate that call. He gets all your recordings. All the data is probably linked by PHR on your consent application, and it works beautifully. And you don't need much more than that.
So Abantika, just to add to what Gaurav said, India is becoming, and you have to really see some of the trends that have happened over the last 6 months. Again, A new category is studying at home, which never probably were only using those instruments that they had. Good or bad, we can keep debating that. But education is continuing online for a lot of people. There is still an issue of access and divide, but people are learning. There is 100 million at least new internet users over the last 6-8 months, which have lived in cities, probably are now living in non-urban areas. They're all very conversant with use of a WhatsApp or a video call, and they know the benefits of all of this. So I think the Indian consumer is really using technology. They are becoming, I always say this word, they're becoming digitally literate before they're becoming alphabetically literate. Many of them are, and they are figuring it out. And we need to keep just pressing the digital literacy and the security and the privacy aspects and the hygiene aspects also a lot more on them. But I think the Indian consumer is pretty sharp.
Dr. Mistry, you said that you would like to elaborate on what kind of training community health workers need for going about their job. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I'll say that briefly. I think what we require is an investment in people who can train. Yeah, that's most important. And one of the projects that we did about a couple of years ago in Pune district brought about a lot of that lessons. So we tried to introduce a mixed method of training within them. So it's not only just training, didactic training using skills and drills approach, but we also had a self-learning component in it. So we train, but we also make the workers inculcate the habit of self-learning from any source that they can find. The other thing that we did was actually make sure that they had practical hands-on experience. And you have now technological aids that can help that. You make use of mannequins. So if you improve their skills alongside their knowledge, then it reaps a very good dividend when they actually go out and work in clinical practice. And what is the most important thing is, besides having good techniques and technology and good content, you need also a conducive learning environment. That's extremely important. You don't have the learnings and the trainings in environments that are not. So it has to be well ventilated, it has to be clean, there need to be toilet facilities, there needs to be water, and there needs to be also trainers who can actually convey what needs to be conveyed. And I think that's extremely important in the training. And the trainers themselves are very important in actually promoting good training. They must have, of course, good knowledge and skills. They must be able to use pedagogy, the correct pedagogy. They must have the time commitment of the training. They're not busy doctors who are just pulled off their clinical duties, told to come and deliver a lesson for half an hour and something or the other, and then go back. That's not the type of trainers you need. They need to have responsible behavior, and they should have good listening skills, and they should give space for interactive questions and answers. I think it's not just a one-way session that you do. And focus on demonstrations and re-demonstrations. Only by doing, the learner learns. So I think these have been principles that have come out. And these are not rocket science principles. These are things that, I think every good person in education would know. And it's good that even in medical education, as well as in paramedical education, we use case-based methods of learning, practical, more understandable to people. And of course, you cannot dissociate this from primary education and the type of primary and secondary education these people are getting in their schools, because that is what will dictate how much they can absorb when they actually get into professional services. You can't have a lady who does not know the basis of arithmetic to be able to know how to plot a partograph, for that matter, in maternal and child health. Yeah.
There's a question from Kanan M. Is there any solution and approaches towards reaching the last mile population with basic required health services and with adequate positive monitoring of health delivery?
Yeah, so I think one of the last ways of reaching the last mile, so to speak, is there are many pockets of our population that are completely isolated, possibly with no access to healthcare. And it's not only in India, it's in very many parts of the world. And I think we need to take on the innovations there. We need to develop cadres from amongst themselves who have the ready reach and accessibility to reach those areas. So again, I would say more investment in local paramedical training. That would be important. Supported, of course. You always need to have a good support referral system, and that could be done through telemedicine or even sort of technologies like the extended community health outcomes. And that's been shown so powerfully in New Mexico by the ECHO team, for instance, where the hepatitis C treatment results in sort of the last mile communities was as good as having treatment in a tertiary university medical center. So I think we need to harness these technologies, both optic technologies, audio technologies, as well as human technologies, with a clear with a clear specification of what each can do and cannot do, and where you need to then go on to the next level. I think that's the way. That's the only way that we can reach our last mile population.
And if I may just add on the last mile. Again, physical infrastructure will always lag. If you look at what has happened over the last few years, then commerce companies have built a very robust, in fact, India Post also has built a very robust delivery network that reaches every corner of India. So using that logistics network, sitting elsewhere, you can deliver medicines to far corners of the country. In fact, rural areas, tier 3, tier 4, are core areas of growth for us because they come to the cities and then they are unable to find medicines when they go back, right? So those are key areas of growth for us. You add in things like what Dr. Mistry spoke about, where you can ship your sputum samples or blood samples, let's say, in a temperature controlled fashion. Again, these are not hypothetical things. They're happening across the world today, where you have this device you can plug in, it automatically gets your blood sample through a micro needle, and you can ship it in your postal service. And that's what excites us, that we can use technology, we can use innovation and bring these technologies to a patient's home and actually make healthcare truly accessible for the first time, using logistics as the rail through which these things are made, through which these things are enabled.
A leader in the BMGF had once sort of espoused the use of drones for taking medicines and collecting blood samples from remote areas. So I think all this, it's just imagination and the will to do it.
Just to add, Abhidika, because we have examples in Bihar where the traditional healers, which are the last mile people, getting connected to the telemedicine centers, which is quality control, and then linked to the logistics services as Gaurav mentioned. So there are systems. I mean, even PATH is also leveraging this thing. I mean, India Post services for the family planning product service delivery, as well as TB service delivery. So there are examples within India also, but we need that scale. Probably that scale business comes in when we have a larger technology platform for all these things.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're running out of time, so I think I'll just give 2 minutes to each of you for your closing remarks. Dr. Gupta, if you want to go first.
I think we are sitting in times where the healthcare, both the physical as well as the physical infrastructure, of course, needs a lot of additions. But the inflection of that with the digital infrastructure is happening. They both go hand in hand. It's going to create a lot more public-private partnership, accessibility, and affordability. We are start of that innovation curve. It's a journey that will probably create the largest health platform in the world, and at a speed and scale that we have never imagined before, and will really disrupt healthcare. I think this is, if I can leave it with that thought, this is the UPI moment for healthcare. When people in October 2016, I remember we had launched UPI, people were not believing. We used to do 10,000, 12,000 transactions a month. Today, we have done in the last month 1.6 billion transactions on UPI. So this is the UPI moment where we'll have a standardized, and everybody will slowly come on board and become interoperable, cashless, digital, and this is the future.
Dr. Mistry?
Yes, thank you. I would just like to share with you a bee in my bonnet, and that's basically preventive aspects. I think we need to focus on preventive aspects of healthcare. I think the COVID pandemic has taught us one thing: we need to look at preventive aspects, which encompasses much more than just medical care or even healthcare. It involves a multi-sectoral approach, and I think this is the sort of approach, comprehensive approach, that we need to bring into healthcare. So it's not only diagnostics and medicines and artificial intelligence, it's also about urban planning. It's also about looking at how populations shift and move and what their things are. So focus on preventive aspects, reinforce human resources, release financial resources, sharpen your technology judgment, and make people a partner with the people sector in health. Thank you.
Dr. Vijayan?
Yeah, so I think this prompts us to think about the health system as rather than breaking out from the shell of disease-specific conversations to a platform-specific conversation. So, and the best example is actually when we use the TrueNat and GeneXpert for TB diagnosis. Now we are talking about COVID diagnosis in the same platform. So the thinking process has changed from a disease perspective to a health system perspective to look at multiple diseases getting diagnosed and multiple things addressed from the same system. And to add on to that, as we speak, the last week, the Government of India released the TB and COVID bidirectional screening thing, which comes with, because last year we did almost 28 crores active case finding. So if you piggyback 10 lakh tests per thousand, let's say at least 30% of that is tuberculosis tested, then you cross almost 73 crores over the year. So just a simple math. So that is the level when we are thinking about as a system thinking when we bring in to address diseases. So I think the larger thought, the provocation from the COVID is think about systems rather than actually thinking very narrow in silos. Thank you.
Mr. Warrior?
So I think, as Dr. Gupta said, I think COVID-19 is that demonetization moment for healthcare technology. What happened with the demonetization and financial payments technologies so we are seeing that, right now, with COVID-19, especially what I have personally seen with adoption across different governments, different state governments, city governments at the national level. There is a huge adoption of our technologies and a huge adoption of other kinds of technologies. And what was, always in the pipeline has now been expedited because of COVID-19. And I think we are at a great place right now where, over the next couple of years, there will be rapid adoption of technologies, AI, in the improvement of healthcare around the country and making quality healthcare more affordable and accessible.
Okay.
I'll keep it short. I feel that we are going to see new public-private partnerships emerge, especially as the government rolls out NDHM. It is very clear that private sector is absolutely crucial to meet the expansive goals that NDHM has in terms of the infrastructure that already exists. So I'm looking forward to all the innovations that both the public and the private sector will bring in to make us a healthier nation, hopefully at a lower spend of GDP as well.
Okay. So that brings us to the end of this very interesting discussion. Thank you so much, Global Health Strategies, for putting this together. And thank you to our wonderful audience for watching this. Please watch and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.